This afternoon, we're going to be talking about business model canvases and the role they play for creative entrepreneurs like yourselves. And so to put it into context, what we want to do is show how the business model canvas fits into a normal business journey that a business might expect to go on, from an idea right the way through to going live. And when you look at a business journey, normally you start with an idea. You think about what that idea is, how it fits into the marketplace, and what the opportunities may be from that idea. But an idea is just an idea. And to actually move an idea from simply being a thought and a concept into a fully fledged business that enables it to make sure that the idea happens, that you can sell the idea to people, you can create products, you can create services, and most importantly, you start to get revenue in so that you can scale the idea. We use a business model canvas, and we'll explain how that works in a moment. From there, the chances are the business model canvas will help you drive a full business plan and a financial projection. That will often sit behind a pitch deck being there to drive investment. And with investment, you're in a position of going live. Now, I know a lot of the businesses around here today are probably already existent, successful, but business model canvases have a role to play even in an existing business in terms of being able to take a snapshot of your business and understand the relationships within it and where they're strong and where they're weak. So specifically in this particular masterclass, we're looking at briefly the process of ideation, just to put it into context, and secondly, the business model canvas itself. We'll also take a look at research, because underpinning both the idea and the business model canvas itself, to make it really succeed, good research can make a huge difference.
Lots of businesses that we've worked for in the past, probably between us the past 50 years of experience, have had great ideas, but they haven't done that research and the market research, and the business, unfortunately, hasn't been successful because of that.
Yeah, that's very true. It's a great way of making sure that actually a lot of the fun bits are backed up by some of the more really harder business aspects, such as how are you going to do it? How are you going to fund it? How are you going to drive the price? But let's start with the idea itself. And interestingly, we quite often begin with thinking, well, what is a good idea? And when you sit back from it, what do we actually mean is a good idea? Is it something that's different? Is it something that's better? Is it something that's a bit innovative? Is it clever? Does it add value? Most importantly, is it doable? Does it face the future? Is it affordable? Does it have a purpose and a solution? Can it make an impact? Is there a potential customer? These are all the things we have to consider when we're thinking about what makes a good idea. And when you look historically at ideas that have been successful, so frequently they address one or other of those issues. Equally, you can see sometimes what makes a bad idea. Sometimes it's unfortunate. Sometimes what can be a bad idea is simply because the timing wasn't right. It was introduced at a time when the market wasn't ready. The economic climate wasn't right. There were some brilliant ideas of restaurants that probably were created in COVID and it didn't work. The demand wasn't there yet. People were trying to launch electric cars back in the 1970s and early 80s, and yet the demand wasn't there. The idea in itself wasn't a bad idea, but because the demand wasn't there and the timing wasn't there, unfortunately, it became a bad idea. So often it's about not knowing the customer, though. It's quite often the case that you don't understand the customer. You think you've got a brilliant idea because in your own world it's a great idea, but it's only when you test it with the customer that you discover actually there are flaws in that idea. And quite often the best ideas are those that are co-created with the customer. Sometimes it can be simply lack of infrastructure. At the moment, obviously things like Teslas are being produced in large numbers. There's a big move towards electric vehicles. But do we have fully the electric vehicle infrastructure yet? Not just within the UK, but globally. Sometimes there can be issues around misinterpreting brand identity. Organisations that think that their brand is so strong that they can move into a different sector and it simply doesn't work. Or even there can be points where a bad idea is simply an arrogant idea or a lazy idea. Rich?
One of the businesses I was director for was a dairy, and we had 500 cows producing lots of Jersey milk. But we got quite lazy in that we thought we could sell our milk to the mass market, which was very competitive. So we had to do something which David mentioned before called adding value. So what we decided to do was take the milk and add value to it. So we changed that milk into yogurt, into ice cream, into cheese, and we added value, and we had a much better revenue model and business than we would have if we hadn't have added that value. But we got very lazy thinking that the milk that the cows produce was the way and the route to market.
And one of the messages that sits behind that, and it will sit behind everything we're talking about today, is that need to talk to the customer. We had a very similar instance in the agri-tech that I was working with as well, again, where we thought a particular type of technology would actually be needed by the marketplace. And if anything, we'd probably over-engineered what the marketplace really needed and what the farms in particular needed. We'd tried to add generators to an electronic weed control device. The farmers told us they didn't need it. So the interesting thing is when you start looking at the theory, and actually, strangely enough, there is a theory of ideation. And it might come strange, particularly to creative businesses, because creative businesses, by nature, often ideas just pop into the head. But actually, there is a way of having an idea. And there is a way of also testing an idea as well. So if an idea just pops into your head, you could also test it. And a lot of it hinges on this understanding your marketplace, understanding your environment, which is why we start with the understanding position. Because if you understand the marketplace that you're in, most importantly, you're in a position of seeing where there might be a market gap. If I go back to the fact that, as I say, I helped an agri-tech business set themselves up. And what they do is they use electronic pulsers to kill weeds. Why do they do that? They do it because you don't need chemicals and it's a green solution. So much of their idea came from the fact that they knew that there was a market out there for volume production of food, but without using chemicals. So they could see where the market gap was. So what they did is they went through the understanding process. They defined the problems and issues in the market, was largely because the alternative solutions weren't there, or if they were there, they weren't scalable. We then go into the classic ideation point. Well, what can we do about it? What technologies can we harness? How can we pull things together to make them work? And in this instance, what they were able to do was pull on a technology that actually had been first tested back in the 1980s. And it hadn't got a market then. They updated it. They built a prototype. They then tested that again in the marketplace. And it's really important that all the way through this ideation process, you test, you retest, you keep testing, because your idea develops and improves. It's particularly challenging for a creative business, because often with a creative business, you're driven by that sense to do something new and do something fresh. And that is important. But it's also important that that novelty and that freshness is resonating with people. And then finally, it's about implementing that. That ideas just magically pop into their head. They can also be structured, and they can certainly be strengthened. We also tend to think that an idea is automatically innovative. It doesn't have to be. And you can have an idea, for instance, that if you build a new suburb of a city, well, it's a good idea to put a shop into that. It's an idea. It's not innovative. Innovative ideas are different because innovative ideas fundamentally involve the process of making them better, faster, more convenient, whatever that sense of value is. Innovation can also be applied, also, even in an existing concept. You can innovate something and make it better. So ideation is not necessarily innovation, but if you do have an innovative idea, it can often deliver a market, fill a market gap far more effectively.
And lots of people talk about innovation. Innovation isn't necessarily invention. Innovation is normally just a very, very small tweak in a process or a product or a feature. You look at the likes of Apple, they just tweak their product every time that they reissue it every year, and they can demand a sort of huge market and a huge price because of that small tweak that they sort of introduce every year.
So we have an idea, great idea, really good concept. However, that's not a company. And why do you need a company? What's the difference between an idea and a company? Well, an idea on its own will just stand on its own. And I see loads of ideas every day within the university. We see loads of ideas within the businesses that we're working with. I'm also an angel investor, so a lot of people pitch ideas to me. There's a very, very big difference between an idea and a business. And the biggest difference between an idea and a business is that a business can make sure that idea happens, it continues to happen, it creates sufficient revenue so that the business can grow and that it can scale. And so that idea doesn't just sit in its own, it becomes a fully complete business and therefore scales. So we take the idea and we use the business model canvas to lift the idea into becoming a company of its own right. And a business model canvas is actually relatively straightforward. It's only one single piece of paper that's made up of a whole series of building blocks. But importantly, every building block relates to each other. And so if you change one part of your business model canvas, it will flow through to all of the others. And it's that interconnection which is what makes a business model canvas special, because it reflects in a company that interconnection that makes a company special.
We work with lots of businesses where we do a new business model canvas every time they perhaps introduce a new product or a new service, to make sure that the business model is as apt and up to date as it needs to be.
I know this is a particular challenge for creative businesses because, again, creative businesses necessarily always think about the whole structure of the business. Now, if you look at a business model canvas, and this is one that we've got in front of us, and we're going to be referring to this in detail for the rest of the masterclass. And in a moment, we'll start working around and we'll begin with the value proposition of what we mean. But let me just orientate you first to what the business model canvas is. It's nothing more than the blocks you see in front of you. And what it shows, as I say, is all of the key bits that you need to make a company happen. You start in the middle with the value proposition. And the value proposition fundamentally is, what does your business do that is of value to the customer? So it isn't just what is your business, but it's what does your business do that is of value to the customer? Now that has to be, in a way, focused on a particular customer segment. So we now start to move onto the outer edge of these boxes. So your value proposition looks towards the customer segments. The customers, if you are going to communicate with your customer segment, you need a relationship, which is the box between the value proposition, the customer relationship, and the customer segment. In order to sell to them, you have to go through a channel. Hence, that's the box underneath customer relationships. So on one side of the whole business model canvas, we have our relationship with our customer, quite often the fun bit. So you'll see on one side, you've got the customer segments, the customer relationships, the channels, and the value proposition. And that's all what we think is the customer-facing activities. Now, the difficult bit, and often the challenge for creative businesses, is what's on the other side of the business model canvas. And that is, how do we do it? What are the activities? What are the resources we need to do it? And if we don't have those resources, what are the partners? That's often the harder bit to work on. And we'll talk about that in a moment. On the bottom, and you'll see over on the same side as all of the operational activities, the partners, the activities, the resources, is the cost structure, because that's where we identify all the costs for all the doing, which is on the operational side. What we, meanwhile, on the customer-facing side, which is the other side of it, we have the revenue streams, which is where all the money comes in. And the magic of a company is simply making sure that the box, which has got the revenue streams, is bigger than the box with the cost structure.
One of the problems we find with many creative businesses is the cost structure side of it, where they don't take into account their creativity, their time, which is probably one of the biggest costs of a creative business. And we'll look at that a little bit later on in the presentation.
Yeah, so let's start working through. So we'll start with the value proposition itself. And what do we mean by value proposition? Value propositions are quite interesting because it's effectively, what does your product or service do that delivers value to the customer? Now, that doesn't necessarily just mean this is what I do. It's how your business actually makes the customer feel, or is it how your business appeals to that customer? Does it provide something new, something stylish, something innovative, something different, something convenient? Does it fulfill a market gap? So it isn't just simply saying we provide these services. It might be services that makes, for instance, in a creative business, if you are producing something that is art, you're not just producing art, you're creating art that makes the recipient feel that you've added something to their day. They feel that an sense of enjoyment that comes out of it. So your value proposition links into that feeling of enjoyment. Quite often, again, they reflect that market gap. So a good value proposition will fill a market gap. And given that the market is constantly changing, it's really important that you understand what people are looking for. So if people are looking for technology, are they looking for technology simply because, for instance, a phone is a means of communication? Probably not. They're looking at it because the phone actually to them is something that they use as a source of entertainment, as a source of communication and contact. It is something so much more than just on its own a technical product. The best way to demonstrate this is looking at some real examples. One of them, for instance, is if you think about a parcels company like FedEx. On one level, FedEx could just be seen to be delivering parcels. But in fact, what they worked out by talking to their customers was that actually, by making sure that those parcels arrive anywhere in the world and anywhere on time, they were giving that people that sense of confidence and security. So their value proposition is not FedEx, we deliver parcels, but it's FedEx, the world on time. It gives you that sense of comfort. Airbnb, again, Airbnb, they have a differentiated value proposition because you could go onto any booking website and book a hotel. But Airbnb are a bit different because Airbnb encourage you to get to know the hosts. And so the idea is that if you go through Airbnb, what do you get out of that? You don't just get, a flat or a holiday house to stay in. What you are actually getting is a feeling of belonging. So their value proposition is Airbnb, we belong anywhere. So the people feel that they belong. And finally, something like Slack, which is a work communication system, again, they could go with, we just have a work communication system, but they don't. They explained that, in fact, the value proposition shows associated with their work system is making work life simpler, more pleasant, and more productive. So a value proposition is about taking your service or taking your product and understanding how it adds value to the customer that you're targeting. And one of the best ways of doing it, by the way, is making sure you talk to that customer. So we've got our value proposition. And as we said earlier, we need to communicate that externally to our customers. Okay. So the first thing that we need to work out is, who are our customers? So it makes sense to segment the market. And again, I know it can be quite difficult with a creative business because in many ways you're wanting to have a mass appeal, but it still does help to understand the different groups that you're targeting, the way in which they think, particularly if you're trying to do something that might be in the creative tech space. That might mean that you're focusing on a younger age demographic. It might be gender specific. It may even be a socio-economic group if it's a highly technological orientated innovation. Normally, therefore, you've got to assume that people have access to that technology. So it's really critical to understand those customer segments, because for your value proposition to work, your value proposition might not work on everyone, but it will work if it's clearly targeted towards a particular segment. Now, that's all well and good. So we've got a great idea and we know who we're selling it to. But you need to understand what your channels are and how you access your customers. Is it online? Is it retail? Via distributors? And that's what that's what the channel box is for. And then finally, how do I talk to my customers? How am I communicating with my customers? How do I know what they want, what they need, and how they're thinking? And so actually within the customer relationships box, that's where you think about, how am I going to be marketing to them? What might be my social media? What might be my face-to-face relationships? But most importantly, make sure that it goes two ways. You're learning as much about them as trying to sell to them. And it's really important on that you know your customer. There's a sort of golden rule that says, you know, above all, know your target customer, know how they think, consider their needs, not just today, but also tomorrow, and listen. Listening is a really important skill. So listen and absorb feedback. You want a two-way dialogue. Good businesses learn so much more. Netflix are famous for this. Netflix, yes, they learn a lot of information simply from the way in which the technology will identify what people's likes are, etc., etc. But they don't just rest on their laurels. They have a very active social media presence where they're talking to their customers. So they get a two-way dialogue, not simply a one-way sell. So we've looked at the front end. We've looked at value proposition, how that relates to your customer segments, how you communicate with them with the customer relationships, how you sell to people with channels. Now, that's normally the bit that creative businesses are really, really good at. And you understand all that lot, and it's very, very exciting. But we need to make it happen. And this can be the harder bit, but trust me, it's probably the most important bit. So let's have a look on the operational side. So on the operational side, we've got to look at the key activities. What does your business actually do? What are your main services? Are you designing? Are you manufacturing? Are you selling? Are you promoting? It's understanding those, and it's understanding those in a very, very pragmatic and down-to-earth way. What actually is making up my business? Have I covered all of these things? Because every one of these activities have a cost, and that can often be something that is missed. So it isn't simply about your time, your materials. It's also about all of those support services. So if you make sure you've identified them within your business model canvas, then actually you're in a much better position when you start looking at your costing to make sure that they're covered. Associated with your activities, if you're going to be doing all this stuff, what resources have you got to do it? what assets, what people, what technology, what skills. Can you identify all the people, all the things, everything that you need to make that happen? And I don't just mean, let's say that you are making, sake of argument, sculptures. It's not just simply that you are actually allowing for a bit of your time, and you're allowing for, you need to get access to the raw material. Also in your resources are going to be the technology that sits behind your website, the ability to take payment. All of these are pieces of kit you're probably going to need access to. You're going to need some tech. You're going to need a space to operate within. All of these things are things you need to consider. And if you haven't got them, that's where the partners come in. So key partners become really important to this. So key partners can be universities. Key partners can be incubators. Key partners can also be, in some instances, grant funders. They can be councils, they can be governments. But all of this relates very closely to how do things happen. And one of the most important things to do when you're looking at this much more down-to-earth side is play to your strengths. Be really realistic about what you're good at, and don't be afraid with surrounding yourself with good people. Often people better than yourselves, because that's the strength of any business, is in its team. And as I say, I've worked a lot in investments as well, and I've invested in a lot of early stage businesses. And we aren't necessarily looking at one person. We're looking at the strength of those people and how they interact. I co-led a management buyout of a big logistics company, and we had to raise an awful lot of money. We were surprised that the investment company, the private equity house, was more actually interested in the three of us who ran the business than they were in the business itself. And their reason was that we were critical to whether or not that business succeeds. But be flexible, particularly for a creative business. Quite often with a creative business, don't have highly structured approaches to things. Be very flexible, be very adaptive. Look to share and maximize facilities and equipment. So particularly in the early days, try to access grant support systems.
As David said, and for example, STEAMhouse here in Birmingham in the UK, we encourage collaboration. We encourage people to use the facilities that we provide. And innovation centres and universities, for example, are very good at putting people in the right direction for grants. But also lots of small businesses, lots of startup businesses go out and buy equipment, and they end up pivoting and not needing that equipment, and then that's a big cost base on their bottom line. So look to share facilities in innovation centres and other establishments where you can, rather than buying them in the early days. Look to potentially to subcontract equipment rather than sort of buy equipment which you may not need going forward in the future.
So if we come back to our business model canvas, so we've covered the value proposition in the middle, the customer relationships, the customer segments, the channels, the activities, the resources, and the key partners. And by the way, with a business model canvas, one of the key things is keeping it into one page. And what you need to do against each of those boxes is just note, what is your value proposition? How does it relate to my segment? What is my segment? What are my channels? What are my customer relationships? You don't need to write great, long, detailed paragraphs. Literally bullet points will help, and they will keep it very clean because you can see how those factors relate against each other. When you've done all of the top bit, you start to see, right, I've got a much better understanding of my cost structure, particularly when we've done the operational aspects at the back. And that's when you start looking at the cost structure. And that's where, because you've properly planned through, even at a very high level, and gone through all of those boxes, you've got a much better idea of understanding what are all the costs that impact your business. In particular, what are your fixed costs, the costs that don't change, the salaries, the office, marketing, technology, those types of things. And what are your variable costs, particularly if you are in a production space? And again, creative businesses cover such a range of different things. But actually, if you're, for instance, You might be doing creative productions or things like that. Some of your variable costs might be associated with the costs of hiring facilities. So that if you're going to hire, for instance, a theatre or something like that, then that isn't a fixed cost. That fluctuates depending on when you are actually, doing your particular productions. So you need to understand what is fixed, what is variable, and you need to understand how that fits into your costing structure. And it's quite important to know your numbers. And because fundamentally, a lot of businesses actually lose track of those numbers. And if you can't keep track of those numbers, and if you're focusing too much on the front end of this business model canvas, too interested in the value proposition and the customers, I know they're incredibly important, but you don't understand what your cost structure is, then actually the business can be getting very, very busy. It might be growing very, very fast. But if you've haven't got a handle on what your costs are, that can lead to major problems very quickly. So that's the cost structure. The final part of the box is the revenue streams. So again, we've now been around the whole business model canvas itself. We started in the middle with a value proposition. We understood the segments it was talking to. We talked to them via the customer relationships. We sold to them via our channels. We understood what our activities were. We understood the resources we need. We knew who our partners were. We worked out all the costs. Now, somewhere along the line, we've got to start selling stuff. And this is really about how we charge. So you need to understand, how are you selling? Is it you're selling a product? Is it a service? Is it a subscription? Are you advertising? You need to understand the structure of your costing as well. So you need to understand, are you building a margin in there? Because you need a margin, not only to make sure that you are ending up with a profit, but also so that you can reinvest into your business. And how you start to understand how you can recover your fixed costs and allow future investments. And once you start working out your revenue streams, you can see, how does your pricing relate to the price point? Now, what do we mean by the price point? The price point, in effect, is what something will sell for. So basically, it's what the market will tolerate as a price. And so what you've got to quite cleverly do is make sure that you can produce your product or your service or your event. You've got to make sure that actually you can still do that cost effectively and hit a price point and allow a margin. Because without that, the business is not sustainable. And working out and getting your price point round can be quite difficult, because it doesn't always simply relate to your cost structure. It's often dependent on the value that your customer perceives the service that you're delivering. So we've actually gone all the way back round to the value proposition again. So you might find, for instance, that you get two supermarkets. Here in the UK, we get a variety of different supermarkets. They might be selling, broadly speaking, the same item. So it might be, for instance, a vegetable like a broccoli. So it might be broccoli. So you might go to a discount supermarket and the broccoli might cost you 50p. I'm not sure what the equivalent Argentinian dollar is, but something like 50p. Whereas you go to another supermarket, it might cost you £1. And you might think, well, hang on, that's not competitive. But the other supermarket might position it very differently. When you walk into that supermarket, there's a different environment. There is different information around that particular piece of broccoli. The other might be served in bulk. This might be served individually. It might have been pre-washed. The difference is that the customer has a different sense of value. They're prepared to pay extra for that because they have the perception that they get more value in the sense of the way it's delivered. Right?
Another example of that is, for example, Dyson. Hopefully you've heard of Dyson. They can sell a hairdryer for £400. because it is the most powerful, best on the market, and lots of people will buy that. If you've got very little hair, probably a little bit more hair than I have, where you don't need the power and you don't mind waiting for 2 or 3 minutes extra to dye your hair, you might go to a department store and pay £20 for it. But there's a place for both products on the market.
Yeah. And it's important to remember that pricing can change on demand. For instance, aircraft, if you're flying on an aeroplane, and if you decide that you're going to be flying on an aeroplane this afternoon, you'll probably be paying a very expensive rate. If you decide that you're going to be flying on an off-peak, slightly obscure time, a long way in the future, you'll be paying a small amount. And the reason is that those airlines are working out the value to you. If you want to go this afternoon, it's clearly very important to you that you need to fly. So actually the value to you is the fact that you're able to fly today, so they charge you more. It's called value pricing. If you're prepared to be very flexible over what flight you use, if you're happy for it to be 3 months in advance, then it's of low value to you, and therefore they don't charge you as much because it's discretionary whether you want to go. Pricing can also be complex because it can be based on other things such as reliability, durability, even image. So for instance, a BMW might have very, very similar specification to a Ford, but you might decide that you're prepared to pay more for the BMW because of its perceived reliability, because it will last longer and have a higher resale, or simply because it gives you a sense of image and a sense of confidence that you've got from having that than you might get from the Ford. So getting your price right is quite a complex art. So the business model canvas on a page, the idea being go through that and against each one of the boxes that we showed you, make simple bullet point notes to understand what your company will do, what your product will do, and understand the relationship between them all. So for instance, as you start working it through, if you realize that your value proposition is based on the fact that you are comparatively cheap, you're targeting a customer segment of basically a lower socioeconomic demographic, you're having to do that by creating a lot of volume of product, and your resources are that you're having to secure manufacture in a big factory. Your costs will be really important to you. Therefore, when it comes to working out your price point will have to be quite low. There is a complete relationship. The flip side happens, and with creative businesses, the flip side can often happen because you can actually work out that, in fact, because you're coming up with something very unique and your segment believes there is a value to it, but the downside is that you have to produce in very small numbers, which is comparatively expensive. That's not the end of the world, provided that you can put a value against your price in the revenue stream. And you see how it relates in a circle. To make all this happen, however, the underlying point is do your research. And very briefly, just want to take you through the principles of research, because there's two real types of research. One side of research is primary research, which effectively is research that is specific to a business itself, and it involves collecting brand new data, normally through talking directly to customers. And the types of things that can involve are such things as surveys, questionnaires, focus groups, observations, a lot of the things that sometimes creative businesses don't do because they don't often think about talking to customers. The second type of research is secondary market research. That's effectively desk research. And that's really about gathering existing data that's already out there. And that can be from information you've already got in your own business, or it can be from outside a business. And there's pros and cons. Secondary research, internet, market reports, government reports, etc. There's upside to both. Primary research, yeah, it's great to do primary research, very specific to the business, it's relevant, up to date, but it can be expensive. Secondary research, it's quick, it's easy to gather, it can be industry-wide, but it's often not very specific to the business, can be biased, can be out of date. But we mention it because all of the good stuff around the business model canvas, how you use it, is only really fundamentally of value if you've done the research behind it. And so to summarize, really, we've taken you through how to have an idea. We've taken you through the role of the business model canvas to enable us to flesh out that idea ahead of doing a business plan. But most importantly, sitting behind that, we've been talking all the time about understanding your market, understand your customers, and that's where the research comes in. And so what I would say is a bit of a takeaway from this one. Once you've done that research, once you've captured that research, build your planning. The business model canvas is effectively a plan. Build your planning behind that, act accordingly, but most importantly, keep responding as that marketplace changes. And that's it. So thank you.